I was brushing my teeth when my life ended. That is not a metaphor. That is not me being dramatic for effect. I was literally standing in the bathroom at 6:45 in the morning, toothbrush in hand, foam around my mouth, wearing an oversized t-shirt that said "Good Vibes Only," which, looking back, was the universe's cruelest joke. When my uncle Crispin knocked on the door and said, with the casual energy of a man asking if we needed more milk, "Seraphine, I need you to pack a bag," I spat into the sink. For what? A trip. "Crispin, I have work at 9. You won't be going to work." Something in his voice made me put the toothbrush down. Not fear exactly. More like that specific feeling you get when your body understands something your brain is still catching up to. The air in the bathroom felt different. Thicker. I opened the door and looked at him, really looked at him, and that was when I noticed he couldn't meet my eyes. Crispin always met my eyes. He was many things: irresponsible, charming in the way that only truly dangerous people are, the kind of man who could borrow money from you and make you feel grateful for the opportunity, but he was never someone who looked at the floor when he talked to you. He was looking at the floor. "What did you do?" I said. It wasn't a question. He opened his mouth, closed it. And for the first time in my 20 years of knowing this man, Crispin had nothing to say. If you are new here, comment Seraphine below because this story is about to take you somewhere you were not prepared to go, and I want to know you made it to the beginning. I found out the details in pieces, the way you find out all the worst things in life, not in one clean devastating blow but in fragments, each one worse than the last. Each one making you think you have finally reached the bottom before the floor drops again. Crispin owed a man named Theron $470,000. I heard that number and I actually laughed. I laughed the way you laugh at a funeral when someone trips, that horrible inappropriate laugh that is really just your body refusing to process what is happening. $470,000. My uncle, who owned a second-hand electronics shop that smelled like burnt plastic and broken promises, owed nearly $500,000 to a man whose name I had never heard before. "Who is Theron?" I said, very calmly, because I had moved past the laughing and entered the stage where everything becomes very still and very quiet inside you. Crispin finally looked at me. "He runs things. Runs things. In the city. And outside the city." And he paused. "In several countries." I sat down on the edge of the bathtub because my legs made an executive decision without consulting me. "You borrowed nearly $500,000 from a man who runs things in several countries." It started smaller. It always starts smaller, Crispin. "Seraphine." How many times I stopped. Pressed my hands to my face. Breathed. My mother, God rest her soul, used to say that Crispin was like a stray cat. You feed him once and you can never get rid of him, and he will knock things off shelves and feel absolutely no remorse about it. She said it with love because she loved him, and I loved him too, and that love was currently sitting in my chest like a stone. "What does he want?" I said from behind my hands. Crispin was quiet for 3 full seconds. I counted. "You." I lowered my hands very slowly. "Come again." It's not like that." He held his hands up in the way that people hold their hands up when they know exactly how something sounds, and they need you to know that it sounds worse than it is. He needs someone to run the household, the estate, manage staff, coordinate events, handle correspondence. He has a whole operation and no one to keep the personal side of it organized, and I told him you were the most capable person I knew, and you told him. My voice had gone very quiet. This is something people who know me well understand is not a good sign. When I get loud, I am upset. When I get quiet, I have left my body entirely and something colder has moved in. You told a man who runs criminal operations in several countries about me. Your 20-year-old niece. The alternative was your problem, Crispin. They were going to kill me, Seraphine. And there it was. The thing that always stopped me. The thing that had always stopped me my whole life. Every time this man turned up at a door I was standing behind with catastrophe following him like a shadow. Because the thing about loving someone irresponsible is that you can be furious at them and still be unable to watch them die. That is not weakness. I have decided it is not weakness. It is just the terrible inconvenience of having a heart. How long, I said. He said. Crispin cleared his throat. Until the debt is settled. He'll deduct from what I owe based on your... Don't, I said. Do not finish that sentence in a way that makes it sound like I am a payment plan. He closed his mouth. I stood up, went to my room, pulled a bag from under my bed and started packing, because what else do you do? You pack. You move forward. You deal with the thing in front of you and you fall apart later, privately, where no one can see. But before I zipped that bag, I turned to Crispin, who was standing in my doorway looking like a man who knew he had done something unforgivable and was hoping forgiveness would show up anyway, and I said, if this man is anything less than completely decent to me, I will not protect you from whatever comes next. Do you understand me? He nodded. Say it. I understand. I zipped the bag, picked it up, and walked out of the only home I had known since my parents died, into a morning that smelled like rain and something ending. And if you think that was the most shocking thing that happened that day, I need you to stay with me. Because I had not met Theron yet. Like this video if you're already feeling this story, because what comes next is the part nobody saw coming, including me. The car they sent was black and long and had the kind of tinted windows that communicate very clearly that the person inside either has significant power or significant secrets, and in Theron's case it turned out to be both. The driver did not speak to me. He opened the door, waited for me to get in, closed it, and that was the entirety of our relationship. I spent the drive looking out the window and making a mental list of my options, which were 1. Comply and survive, 2. Attempt to escape and probably not survive, or 3. Somehow turn this situation into something I could control. I have always been a third option kind of person. It is both my greatest strength and the reason I have never once had a boring life, even when I desperately wanted one. We drove for 40 minutes outside the city. The buildings thinned out and the roads widened, and then we turned through a gate that opened without the driver doing anything visible, which meant there were people watching, which meant this was not a casual operation. We came up a long drive lined with trees that looked like they had been there for a century, and at the end of it was a house. I say house because I don't know what else to call it. It was enormous and old and built from stone that had gone dark with age, with tall windows that caught the gray morning light and threw it back in pieces. It looked like the kind of place that had history in its walls, not all of it good. It looked like somewhere a person could disappear and no one would know which room to look in. I got out of the car. A woman was waiting at the front door. 50s, sharp eyes, the posture of someone who had spent decades being efficient. She introduced herself as Mara, the head of household staff, and informed me that I would be meeting with Mr. Theron at 10 o'clock, that my room was prepared, and that breakfast was available in the kitchen if I wanted it. I wanted it. I had not eaten, and I had learned a long time ago that you cannot manage a crisis on an empty stomach. So I followed Mara through the house, through hallways that were wide and quiet and decorated with the kind of restraint that costs more than excess, and into a kitchen that was warm and smelled like coffee and was staffed by a cook named Petra who took one look at me and put a plate in front of me without asking what I wanted. Eggs, toast, sliced tomatoes, a cup of coffee so strong it was basically a threat. I ate all of it. At 5 minutes to 10, Mara came to collect me. She led me to a room at the back of the house, knocked once, opened the door, and stepped aside. I walked in. Theron was standing at the window. This is the part where I have to be completely honest with you, and honesty, in this case, is uncomfortable. Because I had spent the entire morning building a version of this man in my head. I had constructed him from everything Crispin had implied and everything fear could invent. Old, ugly, cruel-faced, the kind of man whose money was the only remarkable thing about him. I had built myself a monster because monsters are easier. You know what to do with a monster. You resist it. You survive it. You tell the story of it later from a safe distance. Theron turned around and my carefully constructed monster dissolved instantly. He was tall. Not aggressively tall, but the kind of tall that reorganizes a room around itself. He was wearing a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows because apparently he had decided that ruining my carefully planned emotional responses was something to do casually on a Tuesday. Silver threaded through his dark hair at the temples. The kind of face that time had done interesting things to, not softer but more defined, like something that had been carved slowly and carefully over decades. 45 years old, and he looked like 45 had been an extremely good arrangement for him personally. And his eyes. Dark and steady and looking at me with the particular expression of a man who is assessing something and finding it more complicated than expected. I hated him immediately. Naturally. Obviously. I want to be very clear that I hated him the moment I laid eyes on him. Whatever happened afterward, that part is important. Seraphine, he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that does not need volume to take up space. Theron, I said, because I was not going to call him Mr. Anything. He had purchased my time through my uncle's catastrophic life choices. He did not get a title. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. More like the acknowledgement that a smile could theoretically exist in this situation. Sit down, he said. I'd rather stand. Suit yourself. He moved to his desk and sat, which meant I was now standing while he was sitting, which destroyed the power dynamic I had been going for entirely. I sat down. That almost smile again. I decided in that moment that I was going to be absolutely insufferable and that this was the most productive path forward available to me. Comment, I would have sat down too, if you understand exactly why I made that decision, because this is where the story gets complicated in ways I did not predict. He explained the arrangement with the same energy a person uses to explain a particularly unremarkable project at work. I would manage the household, staff schedules, vendor relationships, event coordination, correspondence. I would have access to a household budget. I would have my own room, my own space, and would not be required to interact with him beyond the professional. The arrangement would continue until he deemed the debt sufficiently addressed. How long is that? I said. Indefinite. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. That's convenient for you. He looked at me for a moment. You're angry. You bought me with my uncle's debt. Yes, I'm angry. I didn't buy you. His voice was still even. I offered your uncle an alternative to consequences. You agreed to come. I agreed so he wouldn't be hurt. That, he said, was your choice. I opened my mouth. Closed it. Because infuriatingly, technically, he was not wrong, and I hated him even more for it. Is there anything you need to make this workable? He said, as if we had just been discussing a slightly awkward roommate situation and not the complete demolition of my autonomy. A salary, I said immediately, because if I was going to be here, I was going to be compensated, and I was going to save every cent of it. A real one. Not deducted from whatever Crispin owes you. Separate. He considered this. Fine. My phone. Unrestricted access. Fine. And I want 1 day a week completely free. No responsibilities. No expectations. He looked at me for a long moment. Saturdays. Saturdays, I agreed. We looked at each other across the desk. And in that look there was something I couldn't name yet, something that wasn't hostility exactly, but wasn't its absence either. Something charged and careful and mutual. You're not what I expected, he said. Neither are you, I said, and I meant it as a warning to myself as much as anything else. I stood up. I'll need to meet with Mara to understand current systems before I can propose any changes. She's expecting you. I walked to the door. At the threshold I stopped, because something made me stop, some instinct I should have listened to that was trying to tell me to be careful, that this place and this man were more dangerous than they appeared, not because of cruelty, but because of something else entirely. I didn't listen to the instinct. I went to find Mara instead. That was my first mistake. If this story already has you in a chokehold, subscribe right now because we are barely into this, and I promise you are not ready for what Theron does in the next part of this story. The first 2 weeks were, objectively, the most bizarre of my life, which is saying something given that my life had just produced a morning where I packed a bag because my uncle sold me to cover his gambling debts. I threw myself into the work because work was the only language I had ever trusted completely. Numbers made sense. Systems made sense. People were chaos, but a household was just a very complicated system, and I spoke that language fluently. By the end of week 1, I had reorganized the vendor contracts, identified 3 areas where the household was being overcharged by suppliers who had apparently assumed no one was paying close enough attention, created a staff communication system that Mara looked at with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this her entire career, and accidentally developed a reputation among the household staff as someone who was, quote, terrifyingly competent, which I chose to take as a compliment. I barely saw Theron. He was in the house. I was aware of him the way you are aware of weather, as a presence, a condition of the environment, something that affected the atmosphere without always being visible. He had breakfast early, before anyone else was moving. He worked in his office for most of the day. Some evenings he had guests, quiet, well-dressed men who arrived and departed without making eye contact with anyone on the staff, which told me everything about what kind of guests they were. We crossed paths in the hallway on a Thursday evening, both of us heading in opposite directions, and he stopped and said, "The vendor issue with the linen supplier. You resolved it. Saved the household about $3,000 a month," I said. He nodded. That was it. He continued down the hallway. I stood there for a moment after he'd gone, which was ridiculous, and then I continued in my original direction, which was toward my room and away from the confusing territory of thinking too hard about why a 3-second hallway interaction had left me slightly off balance. The dark humor of my situation was not lost on me, by the way. I want you to know that I was aware, in real time, of exactly how absurd my life had become. I had a university degree in business administration. I had dreams. I had a 5-year plan that had involved a graduate program and an entry-level position at a firm downtown and a small apartment with good light. Instead, I was managing the household of a criminal enterprise in a stone mansion outside the city, saving money on linen contracts, and trying not to notice that the man responsible for my presence here had the kind of eyes that made you feel like you were being read in a language you didn't know you'd written. This is fine. Everything is fine. The linen contract is saving $3,000 a month. Week 3 was when things started to shift, and it started, of all places, in the kitchen. It was a Saturday, my free day, and I had decided to make myself breakfast rather than waiting for Petra to arrive because it was 7 in the morning and I was awake because my brain had decided that sleeping past 6 was a luxury it was no longer offering me. I was making eggs, terribly, because it turns out that watching someone else cook for you every day does not improve your own cooking in any way, when Theron walked in. He stopped in the doorway, looked at the pan, looked at me, looked at the pan again. "Are those eggs or is that a crime scene?" he said. I stared at him. "Did you just make a joke?" "I don't make jokes." "That was a joke." "It was an observation. About my eggs." "Your eggs are concerning." I looked down at the pan. They were, admittedly, concerning. I'm better at systems than cooking. I can see that. He moved to the refrigerator, took out ingredients with the efficiency of someone who actually knew what they were doing, and, before I had fully processed what was happening, he had taken my pan, cleaned it, and was making eggs. In his own kitchen. At 7 on a Saturday morning. While I stood to the side feeling like I had entered a parallel universe. "You cook," I said. I lived alone for a long time. A criminal who cooks his own breakfast. I'm multidimensional. I laughed. It came out before I could stop it, genuine and surprised, and he glanced at me when I did, just briefly, and then looked back at the pan. I pressed my lips together and looked at the ceiling and told myself very firmly that laughing at something he said was fine and meant nothing and was simply the natural human response to an unexpected moment of levity. He put a plate in front of me. The eggs were perfect. Infuriatingly perfect. "Thank you," I said, because my mother raised me right regardless of the circumstances. He poured himself a coffee, leaned against the counter, and drank it looking out the kitchen window at the morning garden. I ate my eggs. The kitchen was quiet in a way that was not uncomfortable, which should have been my second warning, because comfortable silences with people you are supposed to maintain professional distance from are how things start that you did not plan for. "Why did you really take this arrangement?" I said, because the question had been sitting in me for weeks, and it came out now in the quiet without my permission. "You could have collected the debt another way. People like you always have other ways." He was quiet for a moment. "Crispin said you were exceptional." Crispin also thought betting $400,000 on a card game was a reasonable decision. He was right about one thing. I looked up from my plate. He was still looking out the window. The morning light was doing something to his profile that I noted and then immediately filed under things I was not going to think about. I needed someone I could trust with the household, he said. People in my world come with their own agendas. An outsider brought in under these circumstances has a clear motivation to perform well and go home. It was practical. I'm a practical decision. You're a very effective practical decision, he said, which was somehow both the most impersonal compliment I had ever received and the one that sat with me longest. Subscribe right now if you can already see where this is going, because I couldn't, and I was living it. Weeks passed. A month. Then 2. And something was happening that I had not budgeted for, emotionally or otherwise. I was getting to know him. Not because I was trying to. I was actively trying not to. But when you live in the same house as a person, when you pass each other in hallways and share kitchens and occasionally end up in the same room when a household situation requires his input and you are trying to stay professional, but he says something dry and precise that is technically an observation but is functionally hilarious, you learn a person whether you intend to or not. I learned that he read actual physical books, the kind with broken spines from being opened too many times. I learned that he never raised his voice, not once, not at anyone, and somehow this was more commanding than any amount of shouting. I learned that he was fair with the staff in a way that surprised me, not warm, but fair, consistently and without exception. I learned that he had a particular dislike for inefficiency that bordered on personal, and that this was, embarrassingly, something we shared. I learned that he watched me sometimes when he thought I wasn't paying attention, with an expression I couldn't decode, careful and contained and gone the moment he thought I might look up. And I learned, slowly and then all at once and then in a way that left me sitting on the edge of my bed at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night having a very serious and unwelcome internal conversation with myself, that I was in trouble. Not the kind of trouble that had brought me here. A different kind. The kind that starts as a small unreasonable warmth in the chest when a certain person enters a room and progresses into thinking about them at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday when you should be sleeping, and then becomes impossible to argue yourself out of because feelings, unlike household systems, do not respond to logic. I was falling for Theron. Seraphine, who had been sold to this man by my disaster of an uncle, who had arrived here furious and determined and with a very clear plan to endure this situation and leave it with my dignity and savings intact, was developing feelings for the 45-year-old criminal who cooked perfect eggs on Saturday mornings and had eyes that read you like a language you didn't know you'd written. I said out loud to my empty room, "This is a problem." My room did not disagree. If you are watching this and thinking, "Seraphine, don't do it," comment it right now, because I want to see how many of you already knew this was going to end in tears, specifically mine. I did not tell him. Obviously. I am 20 years old and I have been in exactly 2 relationships in my life, one of which lasted 4 months and ended because we disagreed fundamentally about whether pineapple belongs on pizza, which in retrospect tells me everything about my relationship history. I did not have the architecture for this situation. There was no guide for what to do when you have feelings for the man your uncle sold you to, which, when I said it to myself like that, highlighted beautifully how thoroughly my life had departed from any version I had planned. What I did instead was throw myself into the work with an intensity that Mara described as inspiring and that I described privately as desperate avoidance. I coordinated an event for 30 of Theron's business associates that went so seamlessly that 3 of them asked Theron afterward where he'd found me. I restructured the household accounts in a way that Theron reviewed one evening and then looked up from the papers and said, "This is impressive work," and I said, "Thank you," and left the room at a pace that was technically not fleeing but was adjacent to it. The problem with feelings, I discovered, is that they are not subtle roommates. They rearrange the furniture of your behavior, and you cannot always see them doing it until someone else points it out. Mara pointed it out. She did it sideways, the way people do when they want to say something and are giving you the opportunity to pretend they didn't. We were going over the week's schedule and she said, without looking up from her clipboard, "You seem to take particular care with Mr. Theron's preferences." "I take care with everyone's preferences," I said. It's my job. Of course, she said, in a tone that communicated clearly that we both understood this was not entirely what she meant. I changed the subject. She let me. We were both professionals. But that conversation sat with me, the way conversations do when they are too accurate to be comfortable, and that evening I sat in the garden, the back garden, where there was a bench under an old tree that had become my unofficial thinking place. And I had a very honest conversation with myself about what I was doing and what it was going to cost me. Because here is the thing about Theron. He was not warm. He did not bend toward me. He was courteous and occasionally, in private moments, something that was close to human in a way that caught me off guard. But there was a wall around him that was not decorative. It was structural. It was holding something in or keeping something out, and it had been there long enough to become part of the architecture of who he was. And I was 20 years old with feelings I hadn't asked for, and I was going to have to decide what to do with them. I decided to be honest. Not because it was the smart decision. Not because I had calculated the odds and determined it would work out. I decided to be honest because I had spent enough of my life managing situations on behalf of other people's messes, and I was not going to manage my own feelings into a quiet corner and pretend they weren't there. I had some dignity, and I was going to use it. I found him in the library on a Friday evening, which was not how I had planned it. I had planned a careful, composed, morning conversation with strategic exits available. But I had been sitting in the garden for an hour working up to it, and I didn't want to lose my nerve. He was in the chair by the window. Reading. Spine-broken book, as always. He looked up when I came in. Seraphine. I need to tell you something, I said, before my brain could stop me. He put the book down. Gave me his full attention, which was the kind of attention that made you feel very seen and very small at the same time. I told him. Not dramatically. Not at length. I said, I've developed feelings for you. I'm not expecting anything and I'm not asking for anything. I just think you should know because I'm not very good at pretending things are different than they are, and I didn't want this to affect my work without you knowing why. He was quiet for a very long moment. Seraphine, he said, and his voice was different. Careful in a way it hadn't been before. This arrangement. I know what the arrangement is. You're 20 years old. I'm aware of my age. I'm 45. I can also do math, yes. Something moved through his expression. Not quite pain. This is not something I can. He stopped. You should go to bed. I looked at him. That's your response. Yes. Okay, I said, because what else was there to say? I had been honest and he had told me, in the most direct, indirect way possible, that the answer was no. I had prepared myself for this. I was fine. I left the library. I was not entirely fine. But I was not broken either, and that is an important distinction. I had said the true thing and the true thing had been declined, and I was still standing. This is a skill I recommend developing. Comment, Seraphine, you're braver than me if you would not have said anything because honestly I respect both positions. What I had not prepared for was what happened after. Theron pulled back. Not dramatically. Not in a way that disrupted the professional arrangement or made the household uncomfortable. But where before there had been occasional Saturday morning kitchens and hallway conversations and evenings where we would end up in the same room and it wouldn't be awkward, now there was careful distance. He arranged himself away from me. He responded to professional communications efficiently and impersonally. He stopped the almost smiles. I noticed all of it and I told myself it was fine and I was professional and I was going to be absolutely fine. Mara noticed too. She said nothing. She was excellent at saying nothing in ways that communicated everything. Then one evening, about 3 weeks after the library, I was coming out of the kitchen late. I'd been reviewing accounts, and Theron was in the hallway talking to one of his associates, a man named Declan who came and went frequently and who I had always found mildly unsettling in the way that certain people are unsettling not because they've done anything specific, but because they look at everything like they are calculating its value. Declan saw me. And the way he looked at me, that calculation in his eyes turning into something else, something assessing and personal, made every instinct I had stand up at once. Theron saw Declan's expression. I was watching Theron and I saw the precise moment he saw it, because his face did something I had never seen it do before. It went completely, entirely still. The kind of still that is not calm, but is the thing that exists just before something that is not calm at all. "We're done for the evening," he said to Declan. His voice was even. Pleasant, almost. Declan left. Theron looked at me for a moment and then continued down the hallway in the other direction, and that was all. But I had seen his face in that moment. And what I had seen was not the face of a man who felt nothing. Like this, if you just understood something Theron is not ready to admit yet, because we are entering the most complicated part of this story. I started paying attention differently after that. Not in a hopeful way, I want to be clear about this, because hope is a resource you have to manage carefully when you're in situations like mine. But in an observant way. The way you notice weather patterns not because you can change them, but because knowing them helps you navigate. And what I noticed was this. Theron was not indifferent. He was actively working at appearing indifferent, which is a completely different thing, and the work was visible in small ways if you knew where to look. He noted things I didn't tell him. One morning at breakfast, a rare morning when we both happened to be in the kitchen at the same time, and he did not immediately leave, which was itself a data point, he asked if I had resolved the issue with the east wing heating, which I had mentioned to Mara 2 days earlier and not to him. He noticed when I missed dinner, because I was working late, and the next day there was a container of food that Petra said she'd been asked to leave in the kitchen, and when I asked Petra who asked her, she looked at the ceiling with excessive innocence. He remembered things. Things I'd said casually, in passing, that a person who was truly maintaining professional distance would not have retained. My preference for coffee over tea. The fact that I found a particular kind of formal event mind-numbing. That I had studied business because I was good at it, but had always secretly wanted to study architecture. That last one came out in a conversation I barely remembered having, one of the early Saturday mornings before the library. And 2 months later, I found on my desk a book on architectural history with a note in handwriting that was precise and economical, like its author. Thought this might interest you. No signature. As if the handwriting itself could be plausibly anyone's. I held that book for a long time. And then I made a decision. If he was going to pull away and simultaneously leave me books and tell staff to leave food for me when I worked late, then I was not going to pretend those two things weren't both happening. I was not going to make this easier for him by being graceful about his distance. I was 20 years old and I had been sold to cover my uncle's gambling debts, and I had fallen in love, and yes, I am using the word love, I know, I'll explain, with the man in the process, and I was going to see this through. I was going to stay. Subscribe right now because the next part is where Seraphine stops being the one reacting and starts being the one deciding, and if you think this story was intense before, please understand we are only beginning. The opportunity came at the end of my 3rd month, when Crispin called. I had not spoken to him since the day I left. I had thought about him occasionally in the way that you think about a wound, checking whether it still hurt, whether it had changed, what the healing looked like. It still hurt. He was still my uncle. These two things coexisted in me, and I had decided to let them without trying to resolve them into something simpler. He called on a Sunday evening, and I sat in the garden and answered. "How are you?" he said. His voice was tentative, which was not a frequency I was used to hearing from Crispin. "Surviving," I said. "You? Better. The situation is Theron sent word that a portion of the debt has been addressed." A pause. "Seraphine, I know what I did. I know there isn't a version of that where I come out as anything other than." Crispin. "Yes. Don't explain it." "Not yet. I'm not ready to hear it yet." A long pause. "Okay. But I want you to know I'm okay. I'm genuinely okay." Another pause. "Are you staying?" I looked up at the house from where I sat in the garden. The lights were on in the library. They were always on in the library in the evenings. "Yes," I said. But on my own terms now. I hung up, sat in the garden a little longer, and then went inside. I walked to the library. Knocked. Opened the door without waiting, because waiting gives you time to talk yourself out of things. He was in his chair. Reading. He looked up. "I spoke to Crispin," I said. "I know. A portion of the debt. That's not why I'm here." I came further into the room and sat in the chair across from his, which I had never done before, and I looked at him directly. "I'm not leaving when the debt is paid." He went still. "I'm staying," I said. "Not because of the arrangement." Not because of Crispin. I'm staying because I want to, and I'm telling you now so you have time to be uncomfortable about it in advance. Seraphine. I'm not asking you to feel anything, I said. I'm telling you what I'm doing. There's a difference. You're 20 years old. You keep saying that. Because it's true. It's also irrelevant to whether my feelings are real. He looked at me with an expression that was doing several things at once, careful and uncomfortable, and something underneath both of those things that he was working very hard to keep below the surface. This isn't something I do, he said finally. What isn't? This. Any of this. I don't, he stopped. Looked at the window. My life is not a place that is safe for someone to. I've been here for 3 months, I said. I know what your life is. I'm not operating under any illusions. You should be. Well, I'm not. I'm operating under a very clear understanding of the actual situation, which is that you are not indifferent to me and you're putting considerable effort into pretending you are, and I'm 20 years old, and I'm in love with you, and I'm going to be here. And you're going to have to decide what to do with that. The word sat in the room. Love. He heard it. I watched him hear it. Go to bed, Seraphine, he said. His voice was different. Rough at the edges in a way it almost never was. Good night, Theron, I said. I stood up. Walked to the door. At the threshold, the book on architectural history was beautiful, by the way. Thank you. I left without looking back. Comment, stay Seraphine, if you're on her side, because this man is fighting himself and losing, and we all need to acknowledge it. The next 4 weeks were extraordinary in the specific way that quiet standoffs between two people who are both too stubborn to blink are extraordinary. I stayed. I did my job exceptionally. On Saturdays, I read the architecture book in the garden. I did not avoid him. I did not pursue him. I existed in his house as my full self, without apology and without pressure, and I let the situation be what it was. He watched me. I felt it the way you feel weather on your skin before it actually arrives. Then something happened that neither of us planned. One of his business dealings went wrong. I don't know the details, I was not privy to that side of his world and I did not want to be, but I know that something happened because I heard it in the house the way you hear structural things, not as noise exactly, but as a change in atmospheric pressure. Staff moved differently. Mara's clipboard was held tighter. Theron was in his office for 3 days nearly continuously, and on the 3rd day, at 2 in the morning, I was awake and heading to the kitchen for water when I passed his office door. It was open. Just slightly. Enough. He was sitting at his desk with his face in his hands, and he was not the contained, controlled, impenetrable version of himself that he showed to the world. He was a man who was exhausted and carrying something heavy and sitting in the dark of his own making. I pushed the door open. He looked up. He didn't tell me to leave, which I took as permission. I went to the kitchen, made coffee, real coffee, strong, the way he took it, brought it back, put it on his desk, and sat in the chair across from him without saying anything. He looked at the coffee, then at me. You don't need to, he started. I know, I said. I'm here anyway. We sat in his office at 2 in the morning for an hour. He didn't tell me what was wrong. I didn't ask. We drank coffee and the house was quiet and something that had been held at careful distance between us shifted, not dramatically, not with any kind of declaration, but in the way that fundamental things shift, quietly, thoroughly, and permanently. When I finally stood to go, he said my name. Just that. Seraphine. I looked at him. He looked back at me, and there was nothing calculated in his expression, nothing managed or contained. He looked like a man who had been holding a door closed for a long time and was very tired. Thank you, he said. I nodded. Went to my room. Lay on my bed looking at the ceiling. And I thought, there it is. There is the thing he's been refusing to let happen. If this is the point in the story where your heart is doing something inconvenient, subscribe right now because what comes next is both the best and worst thing that could happen, and I could not have predicted it. The next morning was a Saturday. I was in the kitchen. Not making eggs this time, I had accepted that eggs were not my domain and had moved on to toast, which is considerably more forgiving as a food. I was making toast, and there were sounds from the doorway, and I turned around and Theron was there, and he looked at me with that expression from his office the night before, still unguarded, still a little exhausted, still honest in a way he normally wasn't. He came into the kitchen, made coffee, and then, instead of leaning against the counter and looking out the window as he usually did in these rare shared kitchen mornings, he sat at the table. I sat across from him with my toast. We were quiet for a moment. "I was married," he said. Not as a preamble to anything. Just, "This is true, I am telling you, here it is." I waited. She left. A long time ago. She was right to. He looked at his coffee. This life, what it requires, what it takes from the people adjacent to it. I told myself after that I wouldn't. He stopped. That it wasn't fair to anyone. To bring them close to this. "That sounds like a decision you made for other people," I said. He glanced at me. "Deciding someone shouldn't be near something because it's dangerous assumes they don't get to evaluate the danger themselves," I said. "I've been here 4 months. I've seen your world up close. I made my decision with actual information. You're 20 years old. Theron, I swear to everything, if you say that one more time. It's a real concern. It's a deflection. You're 25 years older than me." Yes. I've also been independent since I was 18. I've run a household for 4 months. I've been sold by my own family and handled it without falling apart, and I'm sitting here voluntarily. The age gap is a detail, not a reason. He looked at me for a long time. "You are entirely too certain for someone your age," he said. "And you are entirely too cautious for someone your age," I said. We balance out. The almost smile. Real this time. Actual. Small and careful and directed at me. My heart did something embarrassing that I will not be describing in detail. "I don't know how to do this," he said, and it was the most honest thing I had ever heard him say. "Whatever this is. I don't have the equipment for it anymore." "I'm not asking for equipment," I said. "I'm asking for the same thing I've been asking for, which is nothing, actually. I told you I'd stay. I'm staying. That's all." "That's not all." "No," I admitted. "But the rest of it doesn't require any particular action from you right now. It just requires you to stop pretending it's not there." He looked at me across the table. The morning light was doing the thing again, and I noted it, and this time I did not file it away. "It's there," he said, quietly, like an admission that cost him something. I nodded. Ate my toast. Drank my coffee. Let it exist between us without demanding anything from it. And that, it turned out, was enough to start with. Comment, "Finally right now, because I know you have been waiting for this moment, and so have I, and we deserve to celebrate it together." What followed was not a romance novel. I want to be honest about that. It was not grand gestures and sudden declarations. It was slower and more interesting and occasionally baffling in the way that real things between real people tend to be. It was Theron sitting at the kitchen table on Saturday mornings, which became an established fact rather than an accident. It was conversations that started as professional and became personal, and then became something we didn't put a label on because we were both apparently people who preferred to live inside things rather than name them from the outside. It was him, on a Wednesday, appearing in the doorway of the room where I was working and saying, "There's something I want to show you," and taking me through a part of the house I hadn't been in before. A room at the top of a back staircase with enormous windows that looked out over the estate, that had been used for storage and was now full of afternoon light and dust and the ghost of what it might have been. And watching his face while he showed it to me and understanding that he was showing me something he thought about. "It could be a reading room," I said. "Or a studio," he said. We looked at each other. "Architecture," I said. "You mentioned it once." You remembered. "I remember things," he said, as if this were an unfortunate personal failing rather than evidence of exactly what I had been trying to tell him for months. The room became a project. A slow one, worked around everything else, chosen for carefully on Saturdays when I had the time and he had, apparently, the inclination to spend time near me in an unofficially acknowledged way. We disagreed about colors with surprising intensity for two people who were allegedly not yet in any kind of defined arrangement. He thought the walls should stay neutral. I wanted something with depth. We reached a compromise that I chose to interpret as him conceding, and he chose to interpret as mutual decision-making, and we were both technically right. The night the room was finished months later, a Saturday evening, the light gold and long, he stood in the doorway looking at it and said nothing for a while. "It's good," he said finally. "It's excellent," I corrected. He looked at me. And then he laughed. Actually laughed, real and unguarded, and I had not heard that before. Not really, not like that, and it did something to me that I was entirely unprepared for despite having had considerable time to prepare. "Come here," he said, which was not something he had said before, and I went. He was looking at me with that expression that I had catalogued and studied and thought about for months, the one that had been partially visible at intervals and carefully managed back into neutral, and this time he was not managing it. He was just looking at me. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I want you to know that before, I'm not going to be good at it." "I know," I said. "I'm 20. I'm also not particularly good at it. We'll figure it out. You're very certain of things. And you overthink everything. It's a good combination." He reached up and touched my face, very lightly, the way you touch something you're still deciding whether you're allowed to want, and I stood very still and let him. And the gold light fell through the room we had built together, and something that had been potential for so long became actual. He kissed me the way people kiss when they have been stopping themselves from doing it for a very long time. Not desperate. Careful. Thorough. The kind of kiss that is making up for all the time spent deciding and finding the decision absolutely worth the wait. If you are still here, if you have been with Seraphine from the toothbrush and the Good Vibes Only t-shirt all the way to this moment, then subscribe right now and ring the notification bell because you're exactly the kind of person who appreciates a story told all the way to the real part, and there are more stories where this one came from. I should tell you what happened with Crispin, because he is part of the story and the accounting of it wouldn't be complete without him. He came to the estate 6 months after I had moved in, invited at my request. He arrived looking like a man approaching a sentencing. He had lost weight. He had, as far as I could tell, genuinely stopped gambling. There was a sobriety to him, not of alcohol but of recklessness, that I had never seen before. He looked like someone who had frightened himself. We sat in the garden. The one with the bench under the old tree. He said, "I don't have a justification. I know. I was desperate and I was selfish and I convinced myself I was protecting you by giving you somewhere safe to go, but that was a story I told myself to make it bearable and it wasn't true." I was quiet. "If you can't forgive me," he said, "I understand that. I want you to know I understand." I looked at him. This man who had been a disaster my whole life, who had knocked things off shelves and felt no remorse, who had signed me over to a stranger to pay his debts, who I had every right to be done with. "I'm not done with you," I said. "But you don't get to be careless with me anymore. Not once. Do you understand?" He nodded. His eyes were bright. "I'm angry," I said. "I'm going to be angry for a while longer. And then I'm going to be done being angry, because being angry uses up energy I'd rather spend on other things. But we don't pretend it didn't happen. We don't smooth over it." "Okay," he said. "Okay," I said. We sat in the garden for a long time. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, not yet, but it was the beginning of the architecture of it, the scaffolding that gets built before the real structure goes up. It was enough. Theron, who had apparently been watching from one of the upper windows in the way that he did when he was not technically interfering, but was absolutely paying attention, came down to the garden an hour later with coffee for all 3 of us, placed it on the bench without saying anything, and went back inside. Crispin looked at the coffee, then at me. "He loves you," he said. "I know," I said. "He's working on saying it." "How long do you think that'll take?" "I'm giving him until the end of the year." Crispin almost smiled. "And if he doesn't? Then I'll say it first and embarrass him into reciprocating. I have no shame about this." Crispin actually smiled. And for a moment, just a moment, he looked like my mother's brother, the one from before the gambling and the debt and the disaster of it all, the one who used to make her laugh at family dinners, and I felt the grief and the love and the anger all at the same time, which is the specific and exhausting experience of loving complicated people. He didn't need to come to the end of the year as it happened. It was a Tuesday. No occasion. We were in the library. It had become our library, the place where the arrangement had shifted and where we had been honest with each other, and it had taken on a different weight because of all the things that had happened in it. I was reading. He was reading. The comfortable silence that had started as a warning sign had become, over months, one of my favorite places to exist. He said, without looking up from his book, "I love you." I turned a page. "I know." He looked up. Something in his expression that was exasperation and something warmer. "I'm saying it," he said. "I heard you. You're not going to." "Theron," I said. Looked up. Looked at him. "I love you too. I've been in love with you for the better part of a year. I told you that in this room. I stayed for it. I think you know." "I wanted to say it," he said, as if this were the important distinction. "You said it. It was received. I reciprocated. We're good." He looked at me for a long moment. "You're the strangest person I've ever met," he said. "I was sold to you by my uncle to pay his gambling debts," I said. Strange is relative. The almost smile had evolved, over months, into an actual smile that appeared at specific moments and was, honestly, entirely unfair as a feature on his face. It appeared now. "Yes," he said. "I suppose it is." We went back to our books. The library was quiet and the evening was long, and somewhere in the house Mara was probably noting something efficient on her clipboard, and Petra was making something excellent in the kitchen, and Crispin was, hopefully, making better decisions somewhere in the city. And I was in a library in a stone house outside the city with a book on my lap and a 45-year-old criminal sitting across from me who had just told me he loved me after months of working very hard not to. And my life was absolutely nothing like any version I had planned, and it was mine. I had arrived here furious and determined with a 5-year plan and a savings goal and a very clear sense of what I was not going to let happen, and what happened was this: not what was done to me, but what I chose inside it. That is the distinction that matters. That is the part that was always mine. The good vibes only shirt, by the way, I kept. It lives in the back of my wardrobe in a room that is mine, in a house that is now also mine, in a life I built from the wreckage of a morning that smelled like cigarette smoke and cheap cologne. I wore it last Saturday. Theron looked at it and said nothing for 3 seconds and then said, "You're wearing that on purpose." "I'm multidimensional," I said. He shook his head. But he was smiling. And that, I think, is what winning looks like. Not perfectly, not according to any plan, but absolutely, entirely on your own terms. If you made it to the end of this story, you're exactly the person this was made for. Subscribe, like this video, and comment what moment in Seraphine's story hit you hardest. Was it when she packed the bag, when she stayed, when she brought him coffee at 2 in the morning, or when he finally said the words? I want to know. Every single comment. I read them all. And if someone in your life has ever made a Crispin-shaped decision, a decision that cost you something while costing them everything, drop a Crispin in the comments and know that you are not alone. And that what happened to you doesn't get to be the end of your story either.